last minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning, Ryan. It's okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as simple as 1, 2, 3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
what's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
You're listening to the Peak Physique Podcast with Andre Adams on the NASM Podcast Network.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Peak Physique Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Adams, IFBB Physique Olympian athlete and NASM Master Trainer. Today, I've got a short and sweet episode for you. This is a topic that I get asked about all the time, and I wanted to just hop on here quick and really share my thoughts and my logic as I'm walking through it. The episode today is Physique Program Design Tips. Now, if you guys have taken our NASM PPC course, you've probably went through some of our training templates. I was actually one of the course contributors on that chapter 18 with the physique training templates. So I'm excited to share some guidelines and just general things that you should be thinking about as you're setting up that new client plan. In this episode today, some of the things that we'll cover are best practices for setting up physique program design. And I'm also going to talk about some general tips on how to get started, what client assessments look like, how do you perform a needs analysis and what is it, and really just general strategies for how to structure your client macro, meso, and micro cycles. Diving right in, let's talk about how to get started and why physique programming is a little different than our traditional lifestyle clients. If you're just a personal trainer at a gym, and you're working, mostly in person with people, and your planning and programming is going to be significantly different than how we would approach a physique athlete, right? So even your online and virtuals, if they're not competing in a specific division, the physique outcomes are less important, and we're focusing on, just general body composition, conditioning, and weight loss, maybe building a little muscle, right? But when we're talking about a physique athlete, cookie cutter is not good enough. Right? The physique athlete's going to have very specific criteria by division that they need to produce, right? So that physique outcome has to fit the criteria, and it's going to vary wildly, even for people in the same division, based on their starting point, their genetic structure, their bone structure, body type. Are you endo, ecto, or mesomorph? All of these things must be taken into consideration when you're setting up that program design for a physique athlete. Where I like to start is by performing what's called a needs analysis, and I'll talk more about why that's important. If I take myself as initially a men's physique athlete, later on I transitioned into classic physique, but when you look at a specific division in bodybuilding, and then we look at the Olympia champion, or we look at what's trending, right? Go back and look at the last 5 IFBB Pro shows, look at the top 5, specifically the top 1 or 2, and you'll kind of get an idea of the criteria the judges are looking for. Now, as a coach, when you're taking on a new athlete, sometimes these are experienced athletes that are already at a very high level, or even maybe professionals. But oftentimes we're talking about novice athletes or people that maybe have never competed, and this is just started as a weight loss journey, and it's a huge goal for them to step on stage. So where I start is by looking at the physique, where they're at today, and what their experience level with fitness and weight training is. And now I'm going to take that physique and I'm going to compare it against top professional, or if you really want the gold standard, look at the Olympia champion for that division. And when I look at the front, I look at the side, I look at the back, I look at the proportions, the bone structure, the amount of muscle density, the amount of fullness. And I start to, in my head, piece together, here's where we're at today. This is kind of our baseline jump off point. And how are we going to get from point A to point B? And as a coach, you're thinking about everything from how long is that going to take us? How long will it take us to be competitive at a regional amateur level, NPC level? How long would it take us to potentially be competitive at a national NPC level, right? The pro qualifiers. And does this individual even have the genetic structure or ability to eventually become an IFBB pro? So this is where I start. Needs analysis, comparing against what the gold standard for that division is. If you're unsure, go to NPC News online, go to rules, click on the category, and from there you can see all the criteria that the judges are looking for with some clear examples of high-level athletes, high-caliber athletes in each division. So now, once you've got that needs analysis done, this is already going to drive a lot of the decision-making, right? Does this athlete need to spend a significant amount of time building muscle before we even talk about prep? Is this athlete starting obese and we need to lose 50 pounds to see what's underneath before we start talking about prep, right? So this is where that needs analysis really helps lay the foundation and the framework for the next phase of programming. Other common physique assessments that I like to use that will help guide your program design. Things that maybe aren't just purely aesthetic would be blood work. So you might have an athlete that looks phenomenal right out of the gate. Maybe they're experienced and they're just looking to get over the hump, right? They've been a national level athlete knocking on the door for their pro card, and they come to you to get them over the hump. However, we do their blood work and we realize, wow, this person has a lot of health and medical issues that need to be addressed, right? You might have some hormone imbalances. Your CBC with differential could be all over the place. Could see high CRP, high levels of inflammation, liver kidney toxicity, right? Things that could prevent them from having a successful prep. Maybe an underactive thyroid, a bit of hypothyroidism or adrenal dysfunction. So make sure you're doing blood work as part of these assessments, whether they're a natural athlete or they're an athlete that's enhanced and using exogenous hormones. Either way, for overall health, wellness, and performance, you start with blood work. I like adding in the hair tissue mineral analysis. So the HTMA is, instead of just a snapshot in time like blood work, HTMA is looking at the culmination of several months worth of data, right? So down to the cellular level, we're going to see, is the body efficient at removing heavy metals? Is there any toxicity? What ratios and mineral imbalances could be affecting central nervous system, adrenal dysfunction, HPTA axis in females especially? A lot of the things that are going to be your main drivers for program design and physique outcomes. Other good ones, common ones you can do right in the gym, or an athlete can potentially even do themselves if they're remote, would be basic measurements, right? So measuring the arms, the legs, the waistline, the hips. These can be good indicators to get your baselines on, obviously, when you're starting, but then also to monitor these and adjust the programming up or down throughout the course of time. And one of my favorites, in-body scans or DEXA scans, many different modalities for checking body composition. I personally have an in-body 570 at my gym, Snap Fitness Kenosha, and we rely on that. Not that we are scored on that in any way on stage. However, when you've looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of athlete data, you start to get a feel for where the most common ranges for successful athletes are at. You know, if I look at an in-body scan and we're talking about high performing bikini athletes, I know from hundreds of athlete data that our most successful national level competitors and our IFBB pros tend to carry between 110 to 120% skeletal muscle, right? So these are good indicators where if I get a new athlete that is just starting out, they're novice, and they only have 92% skeletal muscle, guess what? Right away, I know we're going to have to go into a significant improvement phase at a caloric surplus, push some heavier compounds, and really just put on that foundation of muscle before we even start talking about prep. On the flip side, we could be looking at percent body fat, knowing that our target is 8 to 10% on stage typically. And if I have an athlete who's starting at 26% body fat, I can kind of math it out in my head and say, all right, this individual carries enough muscle, but it's going to take them a significant amount of time to recomp and hit the stage lean target. And here's about where that's going to land, right? And this will fall more into when we talk about macro, meso, micro cycle planning. This is more the macro meso cycle that we would start to look at based off of these assessments. Health history questionnaire and athlete medical background, definitely mandatory. In order to set up a successful physique program, you have to understand what the client's limitations could be. Maybe they've got a pre-existing injury, or who knows what going on, right? Maybe there's something that could inhibit the way that they train or they diet. So make sure that for liability reasons, and then also for the most successful outcomes, you're getting that basic health history questionnaire as part of the assessment process. Guys, if you're just joining us, this is the NASM Peak Physique Podcast, and I am giving away some free tips today on how to set up your physique programming. All right, we talked on those assessments, needs analysis, why the physique programming is a little different than your traditional lifestyle programming. Now I want to talk about how to go ahead and let's get to that point where we're setting up that initial base plan for an athlete. Right now, setting up your macro cycle and meso cycle, you have to base this around a few different things, right? One is those assessments that we just did. This is going to give you the framework of where we're going to start with this individual. But the other thing that you need to take into consideration is the athlete goal, right? You might have a certain vision of where you'd like to take this athlete, but it might be the opposite direction that the athlete wants to go, right? Maybe you feel they should be in a certain division, like wellness, but they want to compete in figure. That completely changes the way that we're going to structure their plan and set up that initial phase, right? And sometimes there's other limitations, such as financial. Maybe an athlete, in your opinion, could be highly successful 8 weeks from now, and we could program around this timeline, but financially, they are not in a position that allows them to compete until 2025, right? So this could, again, alter the way that we approach their program design and training. Now, when we're setting these initial plans up, you want to map out kind of high-level phases of training by month and what period or phase of training. So right now, let's talk about fall 2024. You get an athlete that's just coming in. We know they're going to need, based on their assessments, let's say 3 months worth of improvement phase and growth phase. So now when we zoom out and we look at that macro plan, we're going to look at the next 12-month block and say, all right, the first quarter, we are going to be focusing on building muscle. So we're going to be training in, let's say, phase 4 and 5, right? 3 and 4. Maybe it's muscular development and max strength. And during those phases, our goal is to put on muscle density, size, balance proportions, etc. And we're not going to drill down as deep as to define what the training split is at this point. We're just mapping out high level, what high level phases are we training in throughout the year. So we could say Q1 is going to be improvement phase. Q2, we're starting this transitionary phase. And then, maybe towards the end of Q2 is going to be a core cutting phase, which is going to last approximately 3 to 4 months, which puts us somewhere into, let's say, Q3, and then maybe as long as Q4 for our actual active season, right? Now, once we've identified and kind of mapped out these high-level phases that we're going to be training in for our macro planning, then we can go ahead and start looking at, the meso planning. Now, I start looking at things like assessing the starting condition of the athlete and approximately how many weeks of improvements will they need before we can put them into a cutting phase. Now, as part of that improvements, there's another step in there, not just improving the physique, but we call it metabolic building. So if an athlete comes to you with a pretty good physique, but they're only eating 1,000 calories a day, that's not going to be very conducive to prep because there's nowhere to go with their calories, right? So in scenarios like this, we might need to spend several months improving their metabolism and their BMR. So building some muscle, increasing basal metabolic rate, and total caloric intake. Now, that's a balancing act because we also don't want to put on excessive amounts of body fat. So sometimes we need to increase their energy output as we're increasing the amount of food that we are pushing from week to week. And if we can take successfully an athlete from 1,000 calories post-show to 2,000 or 2,500 calories, Now our metabolism has adapted to a very high level. And when we start that core cutting phase, metabolism's firing at a high level. You're going to have a very productive on-season and prep. So factor in whether or not you're going to need a metabolic building phase, and if so, approximately how long. And again, this comes back to that health history questionnaire and also understanding those blood labs. Is the thyroid functioning at a high level already? Do we need to spend time correcting some of these hormonal imbalances? All of this is going to feed into your timeline, okay? And then again, building the correct amount of muscle density and proportions to fit the criteria for the division. Maybe you carry 120% muscle as a bikini athlete, which is good, but it's all in your upper body, right? So it's not distributed properly. The glutes are underactive. The glutes might be undersized. So then we would still have to spend a bit of time balancing out the physique. So this is where a coach's expertise is going to come in handy, and just helping guide the athlete through this macro and meso cycle, right? Then once we have sort of identified approximately how much time we need for improvements in metabolic building, from that point, that's going to be your jump off point for what we call the core cutting phase. So now we've predicted that after 3 months, we're going to be in a pretty good spot to start prep. Now I'm going to consider about how many weeks of cutting are we going to need to get stage lean. And here's my rule of thumb for you guys. Stop, and this is the most common mistake I see, stop programming in a way that you're barely able to get stage lean heading into the show. You should start thinking about programming such that the athlete comes in fat-free and stage lean about 2 to 4 weeks out from the show. This gives you so much more flexibility, and it's going to be so much more sustainable for your athletes when you just give yourself a little bit more time. If you think you need 12 to 14 weeks of prep, give yourself 16 to 18, right? And what this is going to allow you to do is, instead of chasing conditioning all the way up into the end of peak week, where you come in depleted, you're exhausted, you're chronically fatigued, highly inflamed, if you get stage lean 2 to 4 weeks out, we can actually do a linear reload of food back to maintenance and start to taper down your cardio, which is going to be a lot more enjoyable for the athlete, but not just enjoyable, the physique outcome is going to be better. You're going to be less inflamed. You're going to come in fuller. You're going to come in tighter. You're going to come in with more energy. And again, it's just going to be a more successful overall prep. So build that into your physique programming and timeline of the goal of achieving stage lean, fat-free condition 2 to 4 weeks out. And after a few preps, you should learn your body. Some people only need 8 weeks to get in shape from their off-season body. Others need 20 weeks. So this comes down again to a bit of, practical outcomes and coaches' expertise as we're learning the individual's body. And then you have to look at, now we've built this timeline of, let's say, X amount of months of improvement or weeks of improvement, X amount of time for the core cutting phase. How does this align with the competition season? If the end of that timeline falls in January, there's usually not competitions in January, right? So this can alter the timeline a bit, and we have to go back to that macro cycle and maybe shift things around a bit, add in some deload weeks, maybe extend your improvement phase or whatever we have to do to align with competition season. So these are the things that I think about when I'm initially setting up a plan, framing out each of these phases, from the growth phase, the metabolic building phase, the core cutting phase, and then ultimately, how does that align with the competition season? Now, we've defined what those high-level macro and meso cycles look like, right? So the kind of annual planner down to the monthly planner. And now we're going to drill down a little bit deeper into a microcycle. This is where the actual customization needs to happen, right? Where we get hyper individualized to that specific athlete and their specific criteria for the division, okay? Now we're going to break down a given phase. So let's say we're going to break down the improvement phase or the core cutting phase. We're going to take that and look at that particular chunk of time. Let's just say it's 1 month. And now we're going to break down that 1 month into 4 weeks and ultimately break down those 4 weeks into a training split, okay? Where I like to start when I'm looking at a month view, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, is I start by thinking about, are we going to be programming undulating periodization or linear periodization, right? Undulating periodization is my preferred method personally, but both can be very successful. It sort of depends on the individual and their needs. What I like about undulating periodization is that it forces the body to adapt to a little bit different system, right? Different acute variables. It helps prevent plateaus. It also keeps things a little bit more interesting for the athlete. So that's one of the biggest things that I can stress is if the training becomes stale and redundant, and it's like every single week they have the exact same split over and over and over. They're training in just the hypertrophy phase, 8 to 12 reps, 3 to 5 sets, the same exercise selection. You're going to feel burned out, right? Because you start to get just bored with your training. So in addition to things like exercise selection and changing up modalities, I like to implement undulating periodization. We might spend week 1 in phase 3, muscular development, focusing on hypertrophy. We might, even within hypertrophy, we could be focusing on time under tension. So maybe it's 15 reps with slower counts, moderate weights, shorter rest periods. We're focusing on, metabolic damage, building up a lot of lactic acid. We're focusing on high tension in the muscle, not so much exercise-induced muscle damage where we're just slamming high amounts of, weight to create the micro tears. We're focusing on the burn. We're focusing on feeling each rep, slowing down our eccentric motions. Versus maybe the following week, we're focusing on maximal strength. I might be in phase 4 the next week, lower volumes, so lower set and rep volumes, much, much higher weight, different type of stimulus on the body. For one, it's going to keep them mentally more engaged and hopefully adhere to the plan better. And for two, we're shocking the body and creating a different adaptation, right? So when we think about specific adaptation to impose demands, that SAID principle, we're putting different demands and ultimately continuing the adaptation process. So this is a good way to keep your athletes more engaged with the training, and it's also a good way to avoid plateau or mental burnout. Now, some people prefer linear periodization, which is totally fine. We might be solely training in phase 3 hypertrophy, same acute variables throughout the entire prep, and then just focusing on leveraging progressive overload to avoid the plateau, or changing the exercise selection or modalities to avoid plateau. Perfectly fine. Some people are more creatures of habit and they prefer the wash, rinse, repeat because they don't want to think about having to relearn new exercises every couple of weeks. So just keep that in mind. Some of your programming needs to revolve around not just athlete goals, but preferences and what's going to keep them adhering to the plan the most, right? So I do like to get athlete feedback, definitely once we've determined what their training split is. And I always give my athletes on Team Adams Prep 10 to 15 minutes of free training. I call it client choice. Now, again, the purpose of this is you might hate the training program that I built for you today. It might be the hardest leg day that you've done. And every Thursday, you are just dreading doing this workout. But at the end of that, we give you those 10 to 15 minutes client choice where you can either focus on lagging areas. Maybe you've got a symmetry, an asymmetry balance that you're trying to fix. Or maybe you just have some favorite glute exercises or quad exercises that you love implementing, and those are your staples. That's your opportunity to do something you enjoy. So definitely programming tip there, build in a little bit of client choice. Maybe you've got your framework, which covers 90% of the training, but give them that 10% flexibility to do things that they actually enjoy. And I promise you, you will get better feedback as a coach, and your clients will also get better outcomes. Just thinking about anything else that could be a good tip. One thing that comes to mind would be looking at the division criteria again. If I think about the difference in how I would program, let's say, a bikini competitor versus a wellness competitor, well, both need glutes, both need shoulders, but what are the criteria differences? Let's start with bikini. Bikini needs to be well balanced and proportioned from top to bottom. It needs to be built on a foundation of muscle, but not overly muscular with not too much density. And the conditioning needs to be good but no visible striations, no hard muscle separations, no feathering, right, or stringiness to the muscles. And if we look at that, right, being kind of balanced in proportion, top to bottom, good hourglass versus wellness, which is similar conditioning, also need, fullness to the shoulders, but nothing excessive, right? We don't want hard capped upper arm tie-ins like you would see in figure. But wellness, unlike bikini, is disproportionately more developed in the lower body. So bigger glutes, bigger thighs. They want to see, more quad within reason, right? Within balance of the rest of the leg. But top to bottom, they should be disproportionately more developed. Now, how would that impact your physique programming? For me, when I look at that microcycle again, now I'm looking at, let's say they're training 5 or 6 days per week. You're probably going to have one, definitely no more than 2 upper body days for wellness. I've even seen some of the top pro wellness champions on the planet that don't even train upper body because they've already built a good enough foundation of muscle up top and they're starting to get downscored for it, right? So you have to look at where they're currently at. Do they already have that foundation of muscle and good fullness in the shoulders? They definitely don't want to see thickness to the arms in any way. But from a programming standpoint, I would say look at 1 to 2 upper body days, specifically looking at maybe just shoulders, a little bit of upper lat work. I would probably avoid arms unless they just have no muscle at all in the arms. So really just, some light back work, upper lats, delts, and then the volumes within those. I would program the volumes on those upper body days about 50 to 60% as the lower body days. So less frequency, lower volume, lower intensities on upper body. 1 to 2 days there, and then we'd be looking at probably 3 days of lower body, which allows us to also separate some of the training, right? Some of the muscle groups. So we could do like one heavy compound day, maybe it's quad biased, or maybe it's a full leg day where you're hitting some quads and hams. We could do one glute ham focused day, which is almost always going to be mandatory for bikini or wellness. And then we could do either another full leg day or glute isolation day, where let's say we've developed enough mass around the thighs and the legs are in a good spot, but we need to help the glutes stand out a little bit more on stage. We would do some glute isolation work where we're isolating the hips and glutes without making the legs bigger, right? And that could be implemented in bikini too, but for the most part, we would be leveraging higher volumes and frequencies and intensities on the lower body per week in that microcycle for a wellness athlete as opposed to a bikini athlete. And you could use this same logic and apply that to pretty much any division based around the criteria. Is it open, super heavyweight bodybuilding, or is it a men's physique athlete, right? It's going to change the way we approach the training. And again, also the athlete experience. If it's a brand new novice athlete who has never competed, maybe they've only got 6 months to a year of experience with weightlifting, even though they have a good frame or structure for the division, you might need to start them at 3 or 4 days of training per week because that's all their body can handle. Although we know that the optimal amount for a physique athlete high level is going to be 5 or 6 days per week, right? So these things are going to also impact how you establish those baselines and that initial programming. And then over time, again, I believe in undulating periodization, but over time, you need to think about how can we progress this over time to continue getting these adaptations that we're trying to achieve. And that's where your coach's experience, this constant feedback loop with your athlete check-ins is going to play a critical role in managing that program design over time. Guys, that's all I have for you today. I really hope that this helps you as you're thinking about starting that initial program and going through those assessments and hopefully catering that plan where it's hyper customized to your individual athletes. If you guys have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out anytime. You can email me at trainingbydre@gmail.com. Follow along online at @AndreAdams_official on Instagram and YouTube. And of course, for anything else, you can always find me on our website at AndreAdamsOfficial.com. Guys, thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Peak Physique Podcast. We look forward to seeing you back again on the next episode.